This is part 2 of our conversation with Moshe Schwartz about the FY25 NDAA. We dive into the science and technology provisions. We talk about what's going to happen next in Congress in 2025. I want to talk also about the technology pieces in this Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. So are there, NDAA plays a big role in shaping the research and development policies of the Pentagon and interaction with small businesses and industry and universities on those. So what are some of the technology specific provisions that you saw in this year's bill?
So let's start with unmanned aerial vehicles, right? Or drones. There are a couple of provisions in drones. You will notice a subtext of China in these provisions, which isn't surprising. But so there's one section, section 162, which is aimed at increasing supply chain resiliency for drones. And it's asking DoD to assess the risk framework. In fact, it actually says, figure out which providers of components are from China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Right? Because we don't necessarily want to use those. And let's find out where those components are and identify the manufacturers in those countries, and then develop a supply chain strategy to not have to buy from those countries.
Congress tells the Pentagon to do this.
Yeah.
And the Pentagon's probably going to have to tell the companies to do that.
Yeah. Well, and it goes further. This provision actually says disassemble a drone and figure out all the components and do a taxonomy.
So reverse engineer a drone.
Basically, yeah. Reverse engineer, find out what the components are so we can create, and we, as we talked about before with supply chains where our building of drones is not reliant on suppliers in our supply chain from countries that can cut us off if they want.
Right. Right.
The other provision is very similar, and it says we want a national security agency to look at this particular company and decide if that's a company that should be prohibited from buying from in drones. So it's very similar to the list of Chinese military companies. 1260H list is what it's called because it was section 1260H of a particular NDAA a number of years ago, where all these companies that are identified as Chinese military companies that you're prohibited from buying from, saying, is this one that should belong?
So I've always wondered about this naming companies by name in law or regulation, which, like you said, it's hard to write law, it's harder to write regulation sometimes. Yeah. It's easy to change a company name.
Very easy.
So naming companies by name, does that work?
To a degree. There are certain companies like Huawei that if they change their name, you're going to know. Yeah. they're very big, you're going to know. Also, to the extent that companies aren't listening, they're being watched and they were identified in the first place, then you're going to know a lot of it. But to your point, yeah, it's not easy. On some level, it's playing whack-a-mole. Now, what would be an interesting corollary with some of these provisions is if Congress would say, DoD, in addition to saying who not to buy from, which would be a blacklist almost, how about putting out a whitelist of who you can buy from? Because if I'm a company, small company, even a medium-sized company, and frankly, a large company, and I'm looking for a particular component, and you're saying I can't buy from all of these, well, that's great. Who can I buy from? And the problem becomes even more critical when you're talking about these critical materials and minerals, where China is the big supplier. So on one level, it doesn't necessarily help to say don't buy from China if there isn't an alternative. And if you don't tell the company who the alternative is, you're putting them in a difficult position, and they may not be able to deliver or may inadvertently get in trouble.
So tying together what we talked about previously, and with another theme here, DoD and Congress apparently wants to try to buy more commercial, especially in emerging technologies that are being well-funded in the commercial sector, move very fast in the commercial sector, and we want DoD to take advantage of those things. But those commercial technologies often have global supply chains, including Chinese supply chains. So what do these provisions mean for the DoD's efforts to buy commercial?
So it's two issues, really. The first one is you are on some level bifurcating the defense industrial base, let's call it that, from the greater economic industrial base. At the end of the day, there are some companies that are going to make the decision, our supply chain is so enmeshed with getting certain things from China that it's not worth our 1% of the market for the Department of Defense for us to change our supply chains and raise all of our costs and then be less competitive. That is a calculus that could occur. And so the answer is we are just basically saying to some companies, thank you, but no thank you. But to the same flip side is, but there are sometimes security risks, and that's what you need to do, right? And so if someone is using a telecommunication piece that could transmit information back to China, that might be a very reasonable position to take. That's the first one. The second one is sometimes these policies in acquisition for the government and other government positions that can be taken by the US government writ large can encourage companies across the board to move out of China for certain parts. And we've seen actually, I believe last year, a net outflow of foreign investment in China for the first time in a long time, and some companies moving out of China. So it could have that impact as well, which then actually allows for more opportunity. And then the third one is the separation of parts, right? And we see this with domestic buying as well. If you require certain parts be in there, so you might have companies that set up different plants or different assembly lines, and they'll track parts, and as long as you can audit it, that's another opportunity as well.
Other technology area that I noticed in the bill was, a focus on using technologies to improve readiness. So readiness of the force is always a big theme. What's this angle of technology for readiness?
So the department has struggled in recent years for their readiness levels. And what we're basically talking about readiness levels is the percentage of fighters that are ready to go, right? The percentage of tanks, the percentage of ships that are ready to go.
Ready to fight.
Ready to fight, exactly. Or go to an operation. It could be humanitarian or whatever it is, right? And there are a variety of reasons for that. But one big one is maintenance. That could be a challenge. So if you have a ship or a plane that is waiting for a part to be maintained, or you don't have enough parts, or it's delayed, you have units, you have items that are just sitting there waiting to be, and you can't fly them. The more you can get it through maintenance, the more things you have ready, frankly, the less you have to build.
Okay.
In fact, right? So what Congress said in this is, here's one way to tackle readiness. Let's use technology. And there are a number of provisions in there. So for example,
because when you think about maintenance,
right,
and the things that go into readiness, it's probably pretty what they call dual use, right? The similar issues on the commercial side that you might run into on the defense side.
Right.
And so there's a lot of technology.
In fact, I would suggest some data I recently saw was that almost 90% of the parts used by the Army in maintenance are commercial parts, right? Or bolts or things like that, that the problem and the challenge is not necessarily getting it. The challenge is not the intellectual property. The challenge is, in fact, that the internal IT systems communicating with each other and making sure you have sequenced workflow. And that can be solved by technology. And that's where some of these provisions drive. So there was this provision, Section 233, that requires implementing policies to use digital data to enhance readiness. Or provisions that we've seen on predictive maintenance. So you're using technology to understand when a plane is likely to need maintenance and bring it in before it breaks down, even if the part isn't broken yet. You have a section 882 on reverse engineering and that's not exactly maintenance, but the idea is if we reverse engineer, then we can do some of the parts, and that could be for a variety of reasons.
And that could be for to eliminate foreign sources or to find those spare parts that maybe there is no one's selling that old thing anymore. Right.
If a company went out of business, a lot of DoD systems are using parts that the commercial markets have stopped a long time ago, years ago, in fact. And so sometimes those companies go out of business.
So a lot of these readiness issues, maintenance issues, you talk about them and I think hardware. Do they apply to software as well?
Absolutely apply to software as well. There are instances of the Department of Defense using software that is being phased out by the company in the commercial market. And they're saying, oh, please just keep doing it. please keep updating for us. And they don't support it really anymore. That absolutely happens.
And on these kinds of things, hey, you should do better things with maintenance. You need to do more on using digital data systems to do. It sounds to me like these things cost money.
They definitely cost money.
So these provisions, do they have money?
Well, there is money in the defense budget. It's, first of all, it's a question of priorities. Where are you going to put the priority, right? The other thing I would say is in a long-term horizon, they can save money, right? And I'll give you a couple of examples. The more you can improve maintenance and have a throughput that's faster to turn around damaged or systems that need to be maintained, the fewer you in fact have to build. It is cheaper to maintain your car than buy a new car because the tire went flat or you need an oil change. So think about, the buses at the local county, all those buses. The more they can stay maintained, the fewer they have to buy, the cheaper it is. Right? So arguably, yes, there's an upfront cost to it. But if you can update, for example, the IT systems in the depots so they can improve the sequence of delivery of parts, you may be saving money in the long term. Also in man hours, you could be saving money through predictive maintenance.
But in the end, they require the Pentagon to find money, adjust the budgets, get appropriations, and do something. So some of these NDAA provisions aren't waiting on regulations. They're waiting on someone to find money to have DoD people do the work that's required.
Arguably, yeah. Yeah.
All right. So I know you're just a lawyer, not a scientist, not an engineer, but this is the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. So what kind of science-y technology things did you see?
So that fits to what we're talking about with readiness. AI, artificial intelligence. There's a provision, it's section 237, that says DoD do a pilot program on using AI to improve workflow. And it breaks it down into two.
So AI for the back office almost.
Sort of, but it's actually not back office. It has 2 points to it. One is for acquisition. That's clearly back office. How are you going to do that? But the other one is for depots. Right? And depots is arguably back office, but it's for the maintenance of the systems.
Right.
So let's use AI to improve that.
Yeah.
And that is a perfect example of, I think, Congress really hitting on the head how to use a technology, a cutting edge technology, to improve something that actually affects the battlefield. So I think that's a perfect one. And it doesn't only talk about depots, it talks about shipyards and other manufacturing facilities. Direct correlation to readiness. There are a couple of other provisions on AI, so I'll mention them quickly. The first one I want to talk about is, so there's the Chief Digital and AI Office, and he has a governing council. And so there's a provision, that's 225, that charges them to assess AI models and advanced AI technology that could pose a national security threat if an adversary got access to them. And in those cases, figure out a strategy for mitigation, preventing that from happening and responding, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a defensive, let's make sure that our AI technologies that could be a national security threat are well protected. And then there's a third one that establishes a multilateral AI group, or specifically with allies. Or in other words, DoD, we do exercises all the time with allies. Let's start incorporating our AI into the allied conversation.
And I caught one, Section 236, which tried to tie together two emerging areas, AI and biotechnology. So it looks like the Congress is asking the Secretary of Defense to figure out how they can make use of AI to improve the use of advanced biotechnologies for national security applications. So an attempt to push DoD to do more with AI, probably driven because they're hearing from commercial companies and industry that there's so much potential here. And I guess arguably because it's a little bit hard still to put your finger on how the department's actually making use of AI these days.
Right, I think there are two challenges from a congressional perspective. The first one is sometimes hard to know what DoD is doing. And so they'll try to give them a nudge in certain areas. Frankly, within DoD, it's sometimes hard to know what somebody a few halls down is doing because it's such a hard, big organization. The second is in their oversight role, it's completely appropriate for Congress to say, hey, and they have different sources of information, like with industry. where they might be aware of some opportunities like this that DoD just really, frankly, hasn't thought of or hasn't gotten there yet because they're so enmeshed in the missions they're doing now.
So what other emerging areas?
Well, quantum. You can't have a conversation at ETI without a discussion of quantum, right? It is not only a great topic, it is a fantastic Scrabble word. So.
Q is 10.
It is.
Or is it 8?
No, it's 10. Z is 10. J is 8. Clearly, I've played some Scrabble in my time. So there's a couple of sections I just want to call out. One is section 231, which requires DARPA to rapidly expand and support efforts to evaluate all things quantum. In other words, DARPA, let's start focusing on quantum, right? On use cases.
So in this case also, it's about quantum.
Right.
But there's another behavior here from Congress. They're pointing not at DOD, they're pointing at one agency and one person, the director of DARPA. You do this.
Right. Which I think is an important point to make because very often Congress will put into the provision, the Secretary of Defense shall. Well, DOD is a big organization and sometimes topics touch on various departments and offices. And it could take, no exaggeration, months for DOD to figure out, well, who should take the lead on this because of turf battles or vacancies or anything. And from what I have heard more than once, tagging somebody by Congress actually helps them get it done. And so I wish they would do that more often, frankly. Different topic though, sorry. But there's another section.
And that section then, just to touch on it,
yes,
it does tie on DARPA's previous work on figuring out what quantum computers, for example, are going to be useful for. They have some benchmarking activities. But it's written in a way where they tell them also who they should be thinking about working with, mentioning the Air Force Research Lab, Office of Strategic Capital, DIU, other places. So it's Congress saying, DARPA, you've got the stick on this, but we want to make sure you at least collaborate with other players when you're doing this.
Absolutely. And I think that is also very, very important because if you take another technology like hypersonics, the US was way ahead in hypersonics decades ago and did a number of experiments that arguably were doing pretty well, but obviously we never got completely there. But it was fits and starts and started and stopped and then had famine for a while and wasn't funded. Now we're not the leaders in it anymore. And sometimes Congress poking DOD and say, no, this technology you need to stick with. We could have been in a different situation, at least in the hypersonics world, perhaps if Congress took that approach with hypersonics. So this could be a very good thing.
And like you said, ETI is all about the quantum.
Yes.
We're doing right now a quantum computing supply chain study, which our team is working on and hope to have released early next calendar year.
So you're marrying two of the topics together. Yeah. I like that. Supply chain and quantum.
Right.
Very nice.
Yeah. So I know that, one provision I saw in here, which I loved, and I didn't know what it meant. There's a provision that talks about human readiness levels, right? So I know what a technology readiness level is. It tells me, is that really basic research? Is it a prototype? Is it actually ready to be used in an operation? There's a scale. What are they talking about when they talk about human readiness levels?
So I'll conjecture a little bit, but I think this raises a much more bigger question or picture, as it were, which is we're pursuing all these technologies. Are we ready for it? Because even having the most exquisite technology doesn't make a difference if you can't actualize, deploy, and use it. So perhaps the bigger question they're asking is, are we ready for some of these technologies? And have we put in place the processes? It could be human training. It could be, not to get into books, but like Isaac Asimov's iRobot. Are they safe? Or are we going to create an AI system that's going to turn around and shoot us, like Terminator? My kids would prefer that reference than they would the Asimov, perhaps. So I think that's what this one is getting to is, are they safe and effective? And the statute actually calls that out. And how do we reduce the likelihood that these technologies will be deployed before adequate human factors are considered? And human factors could be something as simple as
ergonomics.
Ergonomics. That's the example I was going to give. Can you sit in the plane and actually fly it? Is there space for you?
Right. Or is there too much data flowing into you and no Marine could possibly absorb all of that information?
Right. Or does the plane have so many G's when you pull up that you black out?
Right.
Right. You have to make sure that the human-machine interface works.
But is this really driving at ethics also, or no, not really?
I'm not sure this particular provision was, but we have seen from the Hill a lot of concern about ethics in AI in various ways.
So does this one then set up, technology readiness level assessments are an important thing. Industry has to help the government prove to oversight people in Congress and within DoD that the technologies are ready to go.
Well, and
is this provision driving it, that kind of thing?
I think more from the human perspective as opposed to the technology in a vacuum is ready to go. But we may have to rethink what we mean by technology readiness levels, because when you start talking about things like AI, it's not your traditional technology readiness level that you think about in a catapult, for example. But there's also another provision that also talks about this, of are we ready? Or are we just running ahead without thinking it through? There's a section 242, which requires DoD to put together a 5-year outlook for biotechnology, a biotechnology strategic map, which seems to be saying, hey, DoD, we want you to go into biotechnology. We, in fact, know Congress wants them. It's in a lot of provisions. But you need to put a strategy and a map together over 5 years before you just run headlong into that, or at least we want to understand where you're going.
And the strategy thinks about research areas, but also building an industrial base and how this stuff is going to be used.
Absolutely, and that gets into supply chain and everything else like you talked about.
Right. Again, ETI working on some of this stuff, right? We're talking about, we've done some work on these new and emerging technologies. Historically, it's been really hard to develop a regulatory framework around new technologies that is still allows you to do creative, innovative things, still allows you to deliver things, especially to the Defense Department that they can use, but still allows you to do things that create viable businesses. And that combination of factors, is this technically ready? Is it useful for the Defense Department? Is it viable in a global market? It's really hard to regulate new technologies, and it's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about with the member companies, especially in these emerging areas. So those are some of the things that are on the science and technology front. Let's talk about small business.
Small business.
What's in the NDAA for small businesses?
So every year there are a lot of provisions in the House and Senate versions of the NDAA for small business. And the action is really what, in fact, gets in. So there are some provisions that are in the NDAA. There is a Small Business Bill of Rights, and that really focuses on customer service of DoD to small businesses, helping them get into the Department of Defense and all those other things. There is a provision requiring DoD to do a report on small business participation in other transaction authorities, which is the authority to do, they're called agreements, they're basically contracts, without having to apply all the regulations that we talked about previously. There are some provisions like that. But there were a lot of provisions, like 9 or 10, that were in fact dropped in conference. So there wasn't that much this year compared to a lot of other years.
The other hardy perennial when we're thinking about NDAAs is the perpetual quest to fix acquisition.
Yes.
So did they fix it this year? What's in acquisition reform?
So it is. I think we're not going to do a podcast next year on acquisition because we're done. Yes,
okay,
we're done.
Very good.
So there were efforts to streamline the process. In recent years, one of the mantras for acquisition is speed. So in traditional systems, you have a milestone A to enter the big system process, milestone B to when it's slightly further along. And so in both of those cases, the milestone A and B, they were streamlined, not certifications, but more guidelines. So you have to consider things, but you don't have to do all this paperwork, basically, is what they're saying. So that was absolutely...
So it reduces some of the bureaucracy of moving something through the system.
And there's another example.
Some congressional mandates on it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's one other example I want to mention is other transaction authorities. So depending on how much money you're putting into the other transaction, you have to get approvals from higher and higher levels. The higher you go, the more time it takes to get approval.
In a bureaucracy like the Pentagon.
Yes.
Okay.
And they lowered those.
Okay.
So,
So in theory, that means things might go faster.
They should, yeah.
Right.
So they did things like that.
So some of those let's go faster things seem to slightly be in conflict about let's make sure we know where every part's coming from.
Yes. So it's a pendulum, right? And a lot of things that you see in acquisition reform go back and forth because it's really hard to find that perfect spot that you stay in forever. In fact, it's probably impossible. And so there's some natural flow back and forth. Sometimes you'll see some of these regulations that were responding to a specific issue, and maybe it was an overreaction, so it's self-correcting.
So this era of let's go faster in acquisition, we're about at the 10th anniversary now of what arguably is the beginning of that new era of let's go faster, which was the FY16 NDAA. And in this calendar year, we're about to see the FY26 NDAA. So it's been 10 years. And I was there helping on the Hill, writing some of the let's go faster stuff. This is just after an era of, hey, we're going too fast. Let's make sure we know what we're buying. Let's do systems engineering and testing and that sort of stuff. And, you know, a little frustration on the congressional side. So we entered this era where Chairman John McCain, Chairman Mac Thornberry came in and said, we're going to write some stuff and try to go faster. Okay, it's been 10 years.
Yeah.
What was the result of that FY16 attempt?
So I'll say there are some concrete results, and I'm going to give you two examples. So in that year, you saw the middle tier acquisition, responding to concerns of the 10, 15 years, sometimes longer than that it takes to deploy major systems. The middle tier acquisition says, for these, 5-year prototyping, no longer than that, and then the second phase would be 5-year deployment, and you have to fit within those, right? That was established in the FY16. And this year, that has moved from a statute into Title 10. They actually moved it up into Title 10, as it were. So that would seem to be an example of something that definitely had positive benefit. I don't know if it was as much as you were hoping for, but it definitely has had some movement.
10 years later, there's a whole bunch of programs making use of the middle tier of acquisition pathway at this point.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
And do we think it worked?
I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. You know, I don't think it's a zero-sum game of did it work or not work. It could be improved, but everything can be improved all the time, right?
Right.
Another one was language on other transaction. So other transaction did exist substantially before this, but in DoD...
It started in NASA in the
Space
50s
Act.
or 60s, right?
Yeah.
DARPA in the 90s. Right?
Correct.
Okay.
And DARPA was using it, but outside of DARPA, right, you didn't really see it used that much in the Department of Defense. And there was language in the FY16 that really, I would say, sent the message pretty clearly, let's start using this again. There had been some scandals with future combat system on other transaction, but this was saying, okay, let's open up the aperture and use it. And that has been one of the more remarkable efforts and has had tremendous impact.
But being around then, if you read the actual law from FY16, there's not much dramatic change in the law. I think it's more the language that was being used by the oversight officials in Congress, John McCain and Mac Thornberry and the Democrats as well, saying that we want you to go faster, make use of this authority that's been sitting there. Right. And that's you know, it's had repercussions starting 10 years ago. Looking forward then.
Yeah.
10 years ago, beginning of this, let's go faster, let's work with Silicon Valley, all that kind of stuff. Are we due for a new wave of acquisition reform? I
wouldn't say we're due. I would say we're in dire need. Does that work? The reason why, and this is not a cutting edge analysis, is we are in a competition for capability. And it is both in developing through science and technology, as well as manufacturing at scale and deploying with the human factor. It has to work, it has to be integrated. And not only are we in a competition with peer adversaries like China pacing threat that we talked about, but when you start talking about things like cyber, like to start talking about issues like disruption of supply chains, you don't need to be a nation state to do that anymore. We've seen disruption of global shipping, right, by a non-peer adversary. That's a challenge. So we need to figure out how to fix this on multiple planes. And then there's the whole competition for new planes of warfare like space, which is still fairly nascent given everything that we've done. It is a nascent area that a lot of people are getting into. You also see these new areas of concern like the Arctic with the melting. So we are in need of that. Not only are we in need of it, I think there's recognition both in the Department and Congress and a lot of other places that there is a need for it. And perhaps the opportunity is ripe for it as well.
So what are some of the burgeoning ideas out there that you think might be picked up by Congress administration coming up in this?
So some of them are things that have started in FY16, maybe some of them a little bit earlier, some later, but let's throw some of them out, right? We talked about the streamlining milestone A and B and pushing down the other transaction authority approval levels. I would expect to see a lot more of that, right? So let's lower approval requirements, let's streamline processes, maybe fewer people having to touch something who can say no.
To go faster.
To go faster, maybe increasing some thresholds. So if it says everything over $10 million, now maybe it'll be over $50 million where regulation applies. So I think that's one big area. I think another big area is automating, acquisition, for testing, for actual contracting. That's another area that is ripe. And we actually saw that with the AI workflow. Mm-hmm. So I think that's another area.
Okay, so 10 years after FY16, are we about due for another whole round of acquisition reform?
So I would say not only are we due for it, we need it. And we need it very much because we are in a competition for speed. We're in a competition for technology capability, and we are in a competition for production and deployment. And without that, we don't win.
So is there evidence that people are sort of working on these grand new ideas at this point?
Oh, there's a lot. So in December of this past year, Senator Wicker dropped a bill on acquisition reform called the Forged Act. And it actually proposed repealing more than 300 statutes and amending dozens more and adding some. So that's just one area, and that's aimed at streamlining, that's aimed at improving the process, it's aimed at speed, it's aimed at technology, it's aimed at a lot of those things, including the inner workings of the department as well. There's also that whole area of budget and appropriations, because that is intimately tied with acquisition. You can't bifurcate the two. If you don't have your budget, you can't buy. It's actually that simple. And so we're now about a year or so, after the PPBE commission. And so there was language in this NDA that says, well, what's your plan for implementing it, basically? So we should see things in there as well. And that's another area that is ripe and critical for reform.
And I think now more than ever, more than FY16, there's a lot of outside groups who are gotten much more sophisticated in developing ideas and pushing them out publicly to the Hill, with ideas for how to make the system work better. Often that means work faster, arguably more efficiently.
Yeah, I think there are two big drivers to acquisition reform. So one of them is not only the groups, but technology, and using technology and AI and all these other things to improve acquisition and speed, just data transfer. And the other big outside group that is the biggest influence is China.
Right. We're sitting here in late-ish January 2025. Project out what's going to happen next on the Hill and the Pentagon as we think about building the next set of NDAAs and appropriations, and what should the membership viewership be looking at?
So there's some big movements that are taking place and need to take place that are key to watch. The first one is nominations. It's going pretty quickly. The names being put out there and even the actual formal nomination process, even though we're only one day out of the inauguration, is going faster than it did 4 or 8 years ago. But that is a key piece, is getting the people in place to make decisions. And that's number one to look at. Number two to look at is...
And that's all the positions, right? Secretary of Defense, Deputy Secretary undersecretaries, lots of assistant secretaries, and then there's a level below that that's also going to be filled, right? All of these political appointees who do important jobs.
And it's even beyond that. It's also Congress. You have new members of Congress. They are hiring their staff. You have people from committees who are going to the administration. They have to be backfilled. So it's actually not just the administration. As you said, it's the administration all the way down from the Secretary of Defense down to people who don't get scrutiny. And it's also Congress. So yeah, it's a writ large changeover. The other thing is, as we just talked about, budget. We are in a continuing resolution until March 14th.
There is no final appropriations for FY25
No final appropriations
to accompany this NDAA.
That is absolutely accurate. And there's an appropriation that has to take place, and there's talk of a reconciliation taking place. And reconciliation, basically in short, is being able to do some budget activities without 60 votes in the Senate. You can do it for spending, you can do it for revenue, and you can do it for debt ceiling. But it can only be done for mandatory spending. And that is an important fact. So even if reconciliation gets done, you still can't go forward completely without an appropriations. Okay. And then there's all the legislative work. So you're going to see most acquisition effort take place for the FY26 NDAA. The action will really start around June when you start seeing the House Armed Services Committee draft, and based on recent years, not culminate until December.
So that's triggered by a budget request coming over.
Which will be late.
Right.
It's supposed to be first week in February, but you can't really come up with a budget for next year when you haven't even done your budget for this year. And for sure, when you don't even have the people in place to build it, and with a new administration, you have to do that.
So typically those first year of a new administration budget requests come over months late, which means the congressional oversight hearings happen late, which means the bills, appropriations, and National Defense Authorization Act are pushed back a little bit.
Well, the National Defense Authorization Act may not be pushed back, but everything else absolutely gets pushed back. But you already see some big movement, particularly in the area of acquisition and budget reform, because, as we said, Senator Wicker dropped this Forged Act, which repeals 300 provisions and all that. That's already setting a marker for the NDAA in these areas.
Yeah, and industry can see that,
Yes.
react to it, send their ideas to Senator Wicker's staff, all the other staff. Here's what we think of those provisions.
Right. And I do want to call out two things in the Forged Act, not the substance, but the point. There has been little of that magnitude in recent years to change acquisition. So not only are we ripe for it and need it, but the steps are already being taken for something to happen. And the second is the draft of the bill was dropped in December, which gives people an opportunity to review and digest and forge and debate and argue and come up with something, as opposed to if it came out in March or April, there'd be no time to react
we'll
and
drop
build
a
it.
link to the current text of the Forge Act with the box. There's other major reauthorizations that we're due for as well, congressional action that affects DoD and defense industry. So, what are other things that people should be looking out for?
So there are two that I'll throw out there. One is Defense Production Act. That is a big one. So that is coming up. And then so is SBIR, the Small Business Innovation Research. Now that every couple of years or so, depending on how they authorize it, always comes up. It would be great to see it permanent, but Congress has decided not to make it permanent. But those are two big ones to watch.
And Defense Production Act is one of those that's complicated jurisdiction between the Armed Services Committee and the banking committees, and now has got a lot of interest from everyone under the sun. There was a time when no one knew what the Defense Production Act was. Post the last few years, I think we're seeing a lot more people understand what it is. Small Business Innovation Research Program, not just in DoD, it's in all the federal agencies. That's going to be another complicated reauthorization that requires a whole of Congress effort to get that right. So with that, I want to thank Moshe Schwartz for joining us. He's the president of Etherton and Associates, as well as a senior fellow at NDIA on acquisition issues. Has helped us talk through what's in the FY25 NDAA and what we have to look forward to. Thanks, Moshe.
Thank you. And thank Daniel. Thank you very much for having me.
And with that, I want to thank everyone for watching another episode of Emerging Tech Horizons. If you enjoyed this episode of Emerging Tech Horizons, we please ask you to like and subscribe and share with your friends. We want you to check out ETI's website, emergingtechnologiesinstitute.org, and NDIA's website to see all of the great events and webinars that are coming up, including this August, the 3rd NDIA Emerging Technologies Conference. Special thanks to Daniel Park and Melanie Yu for producing this podcast. Thanks again, Moshe, for joining us today. And thank you all for watching Emerging Tech Horizons.